Sorry about that. Okay, so now we are officially recording. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Wolf Park's first ever webinar. It is really great to see everybody tuning in from all over the country and world. My name is Christopher Lyle, and I am the program coordinator here at Wolf Park. And I am thrilled to introduce Dr. Clive Wynne for this first ever Wolf Park webinar. Dr. Clive Wynne is the Director of Research here at Wolf Park. He is the founding director of the Canine Science Collaboratory at Arizona State University. He is the author of the 2019 book, Dog is Love, which features some of his groundbreaking research he has done here at Wolf Park and throughout the world. And Dr. Wynne has also published over 100 peer-reviewed scientific journal articles and has been featured in Psychology Today, the New York Times, and in multiple television documentaries. So before I turn the virtual mic over to Clive, I would like to ask everyone to use the Q&A feature rather than the chat if you have questions. That way we're able to more easily keep track of them and get to them at the end of the program. If you type them into the chat, we may or may not get to see them. So again, please use the Q&A to ask your questions. So without further ado, here is Dr. Clive Wynne.
Thank you, Christopher, for the kind introduction. Thank you all for showing up, as it were, showing up, I don't know, sitting at your computer. These strange times we live in, but, you know, there are these kinds of consolations that we can just get together and have a chat about something that we're all interested in. And it doesn't matter where you are in the world. You don't need to worry about even just hopping in your car and driving down the street or flying in from Argentina or wherever you may be in the world. We're all just together for an hour or so. And I thought what I would do today, because I've given other talks to Wolf Park audiences and I talk about all sorts of things all the time to do with dogs and wolves, of course. All of our dogs are descended from wolves and only from wolves. And I often mention one particular type of study that I just call the pointing study. And I thought today, if I'm just going to have an hour or, 45, 50 minutes, so I leave time for questions, I thought I would dig deeper into this one issue and explore that with you and give you a stronger sense of why scientists consider this to be such an important thing to find out more about. This morning when I was setting this up, I went digging through all my PowerPoints as I do when I'm going to give a new talk, to steal a slide from here and steal a slide from there. And I realized that I have so many different kinds of slides that I use to talk about how special dogs are. And I thought, here's something I haven't spoken about for a long time. So I dug out a slide. I don't remember when I made it, at least 10 years ago. And it's just a little slide about dogs in ancient Egypt. And the reason I like this slide is because I think that it contains the earliest written evidence that people cared about dogs. There's older evidence that strongly implies that people cared about dogs. And that goes back 8, 10, 14,000 years ago, when we just find graves where people buried dogs with great, great care. But people 8, 10, 15,000 years ago, they couldn't write. So there's no explicit record of what they were thinking. So this is the oldest record I know of that contains the captured, frozen thoughts of a person who's been dead for a very, very long time. And the top image is a mummified dog from ancient Egypt. The top image actually does not, strictly speaking, belong with the lower image, but I just wanted to show you a dog from ancient Egypt, which actually looks a lot like my dog, Xephos. What I'm actually really talking about here is the lower image, which is a stone from a grave, and it's from the grave of a dog. And the hieroglyphs on there express a thought. And here's what they say. Oops. Here's what they say. So I'm sure that's now perfectly clear, right? So apparently the translation of this is, the dog which was the guard of His Majesty, Abutruv is his name. His Majesty ordered that he be buried ceremonially, that he be given a coffin from the royal treasury, fine linen in great quantity, and incense. His Majesty also gave perfumed ointment and ordered that a tomb be built by the gangs of masons. His Majesty did this for him in order that he, meaning the dog, might be honored before the great god Anubis. Isn't that amazing? That's 4,300 years ago. This text is therefore among the earliest texts that humans wrote down. Humans only figured out how to record their thoughts a few centuries before this. So among the earliest thoughts that have been captured and can still be inspected and read is this thought about how important this one particular guard dog was. So this clearly indicates that this person and this dog had more than just a functional relationship. I mean, the dog is described as the guard of His Majesty, but the dog is not just a machine. The dog is not just a functional object. This dog had an emotional connection with His Majesty, and His Majesty ordered that the maximum on effort be placed into recording and celebrating the death and the life of this animal, which clearly indicates that this was a strong emotional connection, that there was something remarkable about this animal. So that's the context. That's the world in which I work, trying to understand what it is that makes dogs so remarkable, so special. How do they get to have this role in human life? I cannot for a moment suggest that I am the first scientist researcher to contemplate this question. People have been thinking about this for a long time. And I thought I would briefly mention, because they don't very often get talked about nowadays, I thought I'd mention the husband and wife couple, Hare and Martha Frank. Hare was a psychology professor at the University of Michigan at Flint, and Martha, his wife, was a professor of something else, I think chemistry. And together they became very interested in what makes the difference between dogs and wolves. I've never met Hare, but we have had some correspondence. And this photograph shows that, if nothing else, he really knew how to enjoy being around wolves and wolf pups. And he was a good friend of the founder of Wolf Park, Erich Klinghammer, and they collaborated and corresponded about wolves and dogs and what they're like to rear. And the Franks had a hypothesis about what makes dogs special, what makes dogs different from wolves, what gives dogs the ability, the potential to be in such a remarkable relationship with people. And they argued that dogs had exceptional social skills, whereas wolves were better at problem solving for themselves. And they carried out a series of studies through the 1980s where they reared litters of wolf pups alongside litters of dog pups. And they gave these animals a large battery of tests, including simple things like an inhibition test where the animal had to just stay still, a manipulation test where the animal had to futz with a box that had a food bowl in it to get the food bowl out, and a rather elaborate sort of a maze thing where the animal had to find its way through a maze. Now, scientists, we often tell our students, are supposed to work to refute their hypotheses. But in practice, most of us are very reluctant to give up on a good hypothesis, and we more commonly spend our whole lives trying to defend our hypotheses. So kudos to Martha and Hare Frank for being among the rare scientists who actually worked and decided that they had refuted their own hypothesis. Initially, they thought they had found results that supported what they were thinking, but they decided to talk to Erich Klinghammer and to visit Wolf Park back then, 30 plus years ago, and learn more about the best way to hand rear wolves. And by the end of it, they felt that when they more effectively hand reared the wolves, actually they didn't find the kinds of differences that they were looking for. So that really is just a historical note. It was a theory about what might be the crucial psychological difference between wolf and dog, that the authors of their own theory refuted it, which, as I say, is what we're supposed to do as scientists, but which actually almost never happens that way. Now let's wind the clock forward a little under 20 years. To a large degree, the Franks, Harry and Martha Frank, were a considerable exception, but to a very large degree, psychologists and behavior scientists in general lost interest in dogs and their wild ancestors through most of the second half of the 20th century. Now, dogs were present at the birth of modern experimental psychology. Does the name Pavlov ring a bell? Ho, ho, ho. Old professor joke. So Pavlov was working with dogs, and we could do a whole hour on Pavlov because there's a lot more there than most people realize. But after Pavlov, academic psychologists moved away from dogs. In a psychology department at a university, there was a feeling through most of the 20th century that it really didn't matter much what animal you studied. If you wanted to understand animal minds, it was felt that all animal minds were pretty similar. And so there was a tendency over the course of the 20th century to specialize on smaller and smaller and cheaper species. And so by the late 20th century, most animal psychologists are just working with rats and pigeons. Small, cheap, nobody cares very much what you do to them. There are not many pigeon fans out there or rat fans, right? Meanwhile, so the study of animal behavior is split, as you probably already know. You get psychologists, I'm a professor of psychology, who study animal behavior, and you also find zoologists who study animal behavior. Over there in zoology, they took the opposite approach. They certainly did not believe, absolutely did not believe, that it didn't matter what animal you studied, and that the minds or behavior of animals of different species were all really much the same. They took the opposite line in zoology, and they argued and argue that each animal has a unique set of behaviors that help it live its life, to adapt to its environment. But biologists tended to view domesticated species with skepticism because they weren't sure that a domesticated animal was really a wild animal, a beast that nature had created. The traditional view of domestication is that it's something humans do. And so there was a feeling among biologists, perhaps not ever fully formalized, but it was definitely there if you talk to biologists even today. A lot of biologists think, well, if it's a domesticated animal, that means humans made it or modified it. And so studying what it does wouldn't be studying real biology. Real biology is nature working with nature, not humans working in nature. And so for a variety of cultural reasons, scientists who study animal behavior kind of dropped dogs. The Franks, Harry and Martha Frank, was something of an exception. Erich Klinghammer was an exception. Ray Coppinger was another exception. So it's not like there was nobody, but there was a lack of interest. That changed in the very last years of the 20th century. And I'll tell you about one of the young scientists who was instrumental in changing that. And that's Brian Hare. Brian Hare, he's, I don't know how old he is. He's a lot younger than I am. He's still a young guy. And he actually started working on dogs and wolves while he was still a graduate student. So very, very early in his career. He was being trained with a famous psychologist, Michael Tomasello, who primarily studies humans and compares them to the non-human great apes, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans. Is there another one? Anyway, those animals, which are our closest surviving relatives on this planet, and they are relatively large-brained animals. And so for over a century, those are the animals, the people who have an interest in human uniqueness, those are the animals that scientists go to compare to our own species, because it seems like that's where you would most likely find something that might resemble human psychology, because they're our closest relatives and they have very large brains, not as big as ours, but still very large. And so the story, as Brian Hare tells it in his book, which I've now forgotten the name of, but he has a book. The story that he tells is that he was carrying out simple tests on chimpanzees as part of his PhD studies. And he was finding again and again and again that the chimpanzees failed on these tasks. He went home to his parents' house where his dog, the dog of his childhood, Oreo is the dog's name, was living. And he thought just for his amusement, he would try out this test on his family dog. His professor, Michael Tomasello, told him that this was a stupid waste of time because if you were looking for advanced skills and you could not find them in chimpanzees, whose brains are, I should have checked this before I came on, but I think the brain of a chimpanzee is about the size of a human fist, or maybe 2 human fists, I forget exactly. But anyway, relatively large. If you're not finding an advanced skill in a chimpanzee, then there's no way you could possibly find it in a dog, because dogs have much smaller brains. Depending on the size of your dog has a brain somewhere in size, about the size of a lemon. If you've got a small dog, it might be more like a lime. If you've got a big dog, it might be more like a bigger lemon. But your dog has a pretty darn small brain, nothing like as big as a chimpanzee. So from a number of points of view, if your chimpanzee is not doing this task, you're not going to expect your dog to do it. And what Brian Hare describes is that he set himself up in the garage of his parents' home and he carried out this test on his family dog, Oreo. And amazingly, Oreo, the tiny brain dog, succeeded where the big brain chimpanzees failed. Okay. And this then led Brian and Michael to publish this paper where they argued that dogs possess human-like forms of what they called social cognition. I'm going to come to explain what we're talking about. First, let me just show you this slide. This slide is the slide that Brian Hare and Michael Tomasello put in their paper, which is now 15 years old, 2005, I think. And what we're looking at is we're looking at the evolution of human beings over here in a human corner of the evolutionary tree or bush. And we see humans' closest relatives, chimpanzees, bonobos. Here in red, you see the evolution of human social cognition. Obviously, by definition, humans have human social cognition. Chimpanzees and bonobos, so they said, don't share these skills. Meanwhile, way off on a distant part of the mammalian evolutionary bush, way over here, where the dog and the wolf are very, very close relatives. Dogs and wolves are much more closely related to each other than we humans are to chimpanzees or bonobos. Over here, the dog, so Hare and Tomasello, the dog shows human-like social skills. The wolf, because they then went and tested some wolves, the wolf, they said, does not. And so they argued that the process of domestication, which is an evolutionary process, just of the latest estimate, the new paper from last week says dogs and wolves parted their ways 23,000 years ago. So let's go with that. That's a blink of an evolutionary eye. 23,000 years is nothing. This splitting point where humans split off from chimpanzees and bonobos is millions of years ago. And that's much more common in evolution. Evolution usually millions, you're talking millions of years. You're not talking thousands or tens of thousands of years. So what they argued happened was that the process of domestication, the selection for animals who would live with people, led to the development of human-like social cognitive skills. Even though their brains are small, their brains are wired to, if you like, think like people do. Okay, so what are these human-like social cognitive skills? What are we talking about? And that's where we get to talking about pointing. That's why pointing is so central to this discussion. Because there were a few other tests. There are a few other tests that have been done as well. But the discussion keeps coming back to this very, very simple skill. And you see this in quite small children, so not in the first year of life, but after the first year of life and going on throughout our lives. people recognize that if somebody points at something, they are telling you that there's something interesting there. And this communication that we go through when we point at something can be understood to be really a quite advanced form of cognitive skill. Because if I point at something, you may understand first that I'm trying to tell you something, that I have a communicative intention, and second, that I know something in my head about what's over here, and I know that you don't know this, and I am trying to share the contents of my mind with you. We're doing, in effect, a sort of mind transfer here. When I point at this, I'm communicating with you and I'm transferring the contents of my mind to your mind. And if you follow my point and investigate the direction that I'm pointing in, then you are understanding that I'm trying to communicate with you and that I have something in my head that you don't have, but you would like to know, right? So, looked at like that, this action of pointing and this ability to follow other individuals' pointing gestures can be taken to imply a very advanced form of social cognition. And as I say, this is what Brian Hare was testing on chimpanzees. He was pointing for the chimpanzees and they were not grasping that he was trying to share the contents of his mind with them. Whereas he goes home to his dog Oreo, the, let's say, lemon-sized brain dog, and the little dog with the little brain appears to be grasping what he's on about, appears to be engaging in human-like social cognition with him, which, you know, when I first heard about this around the time it came out in the late 1990s, this was a pretty amazing finding. And we were all pretty stunned by this. Okay. Then what happens? A few years after, as these results that Brian Hare and others are producing, which are so stimulating, I decide to get involved in this game myself. And to my wonderful good fortune, around the same time, I took on a new graduate student who was willing to take a chance and get involved in research with a professor who wanted to do research of a type that he had never done before. I tell you, if you're looking to go to graduate school, it's generally not a good idea to sign up with somebody who does not have experience in the domain that he or she is proposing that you and he or she might work together on. That's not usually a good idea. But Monique Udell was willing to take this chance and work with me on this. And my goodness, we have never looked back. It's been it remains a wonderful working partnership. This is Monique. You may know her from other seminars or whatever. And she's now a professor at Oregon State University, where she continues to work on dogs. She continues to come out to Wolf Park and work on wolves. And she also does a bit of work on cats, but you know, nobody's perfect. So here she is pointing at a container on the ground so that we can see whether people's dogs do what Brian Hare says they will do. Will they follow a human pointing gesture? And the answer is yes. Quite straightforwardly, yes. They go where you point. At this stage, we're confirming what Brian Hare says happens. Great. It would be interesting to test some wolves for ourselves. But we really didn't know, where do you find a wolf? How do you go and do this? And so another piece of wonderful good luck in my professional life is that I got an email from the people out at Wolf Park, where we are all sort of together right now in some sense. And they said, hey, we've been hearing about this research, this new research, where they say that wolves won't follow human pointing gestures and wolves don't understand what people are up to when they do things like that. And we're not really sure that this is right because, hey, we spend our working days with these wolves that we reared ourselves and that we meet with every day and interact with every day. And then we go home in the evening and we all have dogs at our homes and we interact with dogs at home. So, hey, we may not be the scientists in this game, but we have a lot of experience around wolves and around dogs. We don't think the wolves and the dogs are actually different the way that Brian Hare says they are. And so we go out to Wolf Park. Initially, just Monique and I go out to Wolf Park and we repeat the experiment, the very simple pointing experiment with the wolves. For various reasons, I couldn't find a video from when we originally did it. when actually Monique and I did not go inside the enclosures and do the pointing ourselves. We let Wolf Park staff do that. This is a video from later on, and this is Lindsay Mercam, another of my past students, now a professor at Monmouth University in New Jersey. And here she is pointing at some containers on the ground. He doesn't get them all right. Okay, so he doesn't get them all right. And just for fun, I showed you a snippet to keep you on tenterhooks. I showed you a snippet where you see him getting 2 correct and 1 incorrect. In the first experiment, we actually tested 5 groups of animals. We tested wolves, and as I described in this original experiment, we did not do the testing ourselves. Wolf Park staff did it for us. We shouted instructions through the fence. And so these wolves were tested by people who were familiar to them, to the Wolf Park staff. They were Wolf Park staff. They were very familiar to the wolves. We decided it would be interesting to test pet dogs under the exact same conditions as the wolves have been tested. That is to say, they were tested outdoors at a dog park, and they were tested by their own owners. It's very easy to do this. You just tell people, point to your left, point to your right. So we had people test the dogs themselves. Because, as you'll see, the results didn't come out the way we quite expected, we then also did a group of dogs who were tested outdoors, and the pointing was done by Monique. And she was therefore unfamiliar to these dogs. I mean, they said hello, but they didn't know each other very well. Then we did a group of pet dogs who were tested indoors, which you wouldn't do with wolves, but we did it with the dogs because these dogs are often more commonly indoors than outdoors. And they were tested by Monique, somebody unfamiliar. And the final group, which I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about for a couple of reasons, is we tested dogs at our local animal shelter. And they were tested indoors in the garage of the animal shelter with the vehicles taken out, and by somebody who was unfamiliar to them, because basically they didn't really have anybody who was familiar to them. So I can show you a very quick video of what that looks like. Okay, I don't need to show you much of that. Okay, so what happens? Brian Hare and Michael Tomasello tell us that this ability to follow pointing gestures and to understand what people mean by pointing is evolved through the process of domestication into dogs. It's the birthright of dogs. And on the other hand, they insist that it is not the birthright of any other species. No other animal, they tell us, can do this. We give each animal just 10 opportunities, randomly, half to the left, half to the right. We only give them 10 opportunities because we're just supposed to be assessing a natural, spontaneous tendency. We're not supposed to be training them. We're just supposed to be testing them. So they only get 10 chances. If you get 10 chances and on each opportunity there are 2 alternative, it's like tossing a coin 10 times. On average, you'd expect them, if they don't know what they're doing, they would get about 5 out of 10 correct. If they do better than 5 out of 10, then hey, that means they're onto something. They grasp what's going on here. Okay, enough spinning it out. Let me show you the results. Very simple results, very simple graph. Okay, like I say, 5 out of 10 would be chance. Better than 5 means you're getting it. 5 or worse means you're not getting it. We have 5 different kinds of animals here. We have the wolves tested outdoors by somebody they know. We have the dogs tested in their home by somebody they do not know. We have dogs tested outdoors, doesn't make any difference really whether it's somebody they know or don't know. And we have the dogs at the shelter. So you can immediately see the headline and the title of the paper that this became is "The Wolves Can Do This." Just as the staff at Wolf Park had indicated to us, Wolves can be just as good at grasping what people are up to when they point and do other things as the best performing group of dogs. So straight away we see that the Hare and Tomasello theory for this cannot be right. It is not the case that this is something that dogs and only dogs can do, because we found some wolves that can do it. They may have found other wolves who cannot do it. Well, okay, we're not claiming that every wolf in the world could do this. I mean, presumably the vast majority of wolves out at Yellowstone who've never been within many, many feet of a human being, presumably they wouldn't do this. But hey, if you go to somewhere where they're really good at hand rearing wolves, where they've been doing this since 1974 and they seriously know what they're doing, those wolves follow human pointing gestures. Point number one, wolves can do this. Point number two, we found that if you test dogs in the kind of way that Brian Hare have been testing them, where you take pet dogs and you go into their homes and you point at things for them, they're good at this. They can do this. But we also found a whole bunch of other dogs who don't grasp what's going on. I should mention here that when you see that it looks like the dogs in the shelter might actually be performing below chance, they're not, in fact, going right when you point left and going left when you point right. What they're typically doing is you can point right and you can point left and they just won't do anything. They might come up and sit in front of you, or they might just run away. What happens is we made a decision that if the animal did not go to either of the containers within 2 minutes, then we counted that as an error. We count it as an error because it is not correct. Now, you could, if you wanted to, and we have done this, you can get into analyzing the different kinds of errors. Sometimes an animal will go left when you point right and right when you point left. That's one kind of error. And sometimes it does something else. We don't need to worry about that. The crucial thing here is that we readily found groups of dogs and situations under which dogs can be tested where they do not follow pointing gestures. The fact that the dogs we tested outdoors did so badly, I suspect, is not really theoretically particularly interesting. I think these were just dogs who had not often done tasks outdoors, and they probably just were not used to paying attention to human beings outdoors. I strongly suspect that you could find groups of dogs who spend a lot of time working outdoors with people who pay a lot of attention to what people are doing when they're outdoors. I don't find that, from a theoretical point of view or from a practical point of view, very important. But I was very interested in why the shelter dogs did so badly. I'm going to take a small detour into a somewhat more applied side of our research to talk a little bit about why do the dogs in the shelter do so badly. Let's touch on that for a moment. One thing is that it's quite possible that the shelter dogs are just scared of us. They've had bad times around people. They don't trust people. That's certainly true of some of the dogs at the shelter, but we didn't try and work with any of those dogs. We only worked with dogs who, if we brought them out of their cages, their kennels, seemed to enjoy hanging out with us. And there was an example of one in that video. That's the kind of dog we tested. They seem to want to play with us. It's also perhaps possible that the shelter dogs are not motivated. And again, some of the shelter dogs are not motivated, but we didn't work with the ones. If they didn't like the treats that we brought along, we didn't work with them. So, okay, it didn't seem that they were scared of us. The ones we tested didn't seem to be scared of us. It didn't seem like they were undermotivated, at least the ones we chose to work with. We chose to work with dogs who wanted to play with us and wanted to eat our treats. Okay, then, so why could they not do this? One possibility is that these dogs maybe somehow were talking extremely informally. Maybe they were sort of like autistic. Maybe they lacked certain skills in understanding people that most dogs have, but that these dogs maybe lacked. And maybe that might have been exactly why they ended up in an animal shelter. Maybe they were not all there, if you like, and wouldn't make good pets. And, maybe. But here's an alternative thought. Maybe they just hadn't had the right kinds of experiences around people. Maybe dogs follow points because they learn in their lives with people what it means when a person points at something. So we did an experiment. We went back to the shelter. We tested the dogs, our standard test, 10 opportunities. We confirmed that there was a new bunch of dogs who would not follow, would not follow pointing gestures. Now, I said we only give them 10 trials, 10 opportunities, because we're just trying to test their pre-existing abilities. We're not trying to train them. But those of you who have a background as animal trainers will realize that since if the animal follows the pointing gesture, it gets a food reward, we call it a test, but it's actually a training opportunity. So what we did was we kept going. We tested them for 10 times, confirmed that they did not spontaneously go where we point, but we kept going and we kept going and we kept going, giving them a trial after a trial after a trial after a trial to see whether they would pick it up. I forgot to name the other woman in the picture. The other woman in the picture is Nicole Dory, who also worked with us at Florida. She stayed in Florida. And I said to Monique and Nicole, I said, hey, go out to the shelter and test each dog all day if you have to see whether they will pick this up. And they said, well, hey, you know, we're not going to spend all day on each dog. We'll give each dog 30 minutes. We'll give them 30 minutes and we'll see, do they pick it up in half an hour? What was our definition of picking it up? Our definition of picking it up was that the animal gets 4 of the last 5 correct. So that implies you have to give them at least 5 more trials. But how many more does it take? Do they ever reach a level of competence where they can get 4 of the last 5 correct? Here's the answer. Here's the first dog. Call this dog Dog A. Remember, because our criterion is 4 out of 5, you cannot do it in less than 5. This particular dog did it, though, in just 7 trials. After 7 trials, this dog had got 4 of the last 5 correct. And that took 8 minutes. Took just 8 minutes. Okay, put that dog back. Get another dog. Dog B also needed 7 trials. And I guess Monique and Nicole were getting a bit quicker at this point, and that took 6 minutes. Dog C needed 29 minutes. And in fact, I think I'm right in saying, yes, dog C was one of the few dogs who did not master this in the 30 minutes. If I'm saying they get 30 minutes and I have 29 here, that discrepancy arises because the 30 minutes is timed live as you're doing it. The 29 minutes comes from when you code the video, you look at the video recording afterwards and you see, well, actually it was closer to 29 than 30. But so that dog C, didn't get it in 30 minutes. But every single other dog grasped it on average in 10 minutes, on average in 17 trials. So, okay, dogs at the shelter do not spontaneously follow human pointing gestures, but they can learn it really, really quickly. Okay, so I just wanted to share that with you. I'm going to skip this a little bit. And I mention that because we now do an enormous amount of our research is trying to understand shelter dogs, trying to help shelter dogs. It's a very difficult part of the dog-human relationship, and we invest a lot of effort into trying to improve that. Okay, so back to the original experiment, back to the original demonstration that wolves can indeed do this. Wolves, if they're reared by human beings, if they live alongside human beings, they can be just as good at following human pointing gestures as pet dogs are. And meanwhile, other dogs are not as good at it. So that then raises the question, how was it, why was it that the wolves that Brian Hare tested, the chimps that he tested, why did they do so badly? And this, by the way, is Brian Hare with a chimp friend. Well, I think we know the answer. The answer is a couple of answers. One answer concerns the conditions of life of the animals that are being tested. The animals that we find are successful in following human pointing gestures are animals who were raised by human beings and who then live their lives alongside human beings. So they are animals that are socialized to people and that are dependent on people, that are motivated to pay attention to what people are doing. The animals that Brian Hare tested, the wolves that he tested, may not have been as well socialized as the wolves at Wolf Park. I mean, frankly, nowhere does it as well as Wolf Park. They just were not as well adapted to dealing with human beings. And the chimpanzees he tested were chimpanzees that were raised in zoos or were raised in research facilities where it is simply not acceptable to socialize with the animals. I mean, okay, that's a picture of him apparently cuddling with a chimpanzee, but that's not how it's normally done. And modern first world research facilities would frown upon that. You're not allowed to play with the animals at a research facility or a zoo nowadays. It's not how it's done. And so those animals hadn't developed the kind of bond with people that you need to have to show that an animal is responsive to what a person is doing. And the second thing is, where Brian Hare tested dogs, just as we did in their homes, in garages, and so forth, the wolves that he tested, the chimpanzees that he tested, were tested with a fence or caging between the human who is making the pointing gestures and the animal who is supposed to be observing. It's easy to overlook that we human beings, our noses may be rubbish, but we have very, very good vision. And we mostly easily see through fences and through cages what is going on the other side. That's not so true of most other species. And dogs and wolves don't have anything like the visual acuity that we human beings have. So the fact that Brian Hare was testing wolves through a fence and chimpanzees through cage bars probably had a major impact on how well they could see what he was doing. We never actually tested this on wolves, but Monique did carry out a test on dogs where she did some pointing from the other side of a fence. And she readily found the dogs tested through a fence just were not able to see well enough what people were doing to reliably follow their pointing gestures. If you go back to an earlier epoch when research on chimpanzee behavior was much, much more informal than it has become nowadays, and where there were several scientists who raised young chimpanzees in their homes as pets, and you read their accounts, they didn't carry out formal experiments, but a couple of them did notice that their chimpanzee would pay attention to pointing gestures. And here's a very cute photograph from a long, long time ago, from the 1920s, when there was a psychology professor called Winthrop Kellogg who raised a chimpanzee in his home alongside his own son, Donald. And there are a number of these very cute pictures of the chimpanzee whose name was Gua and the boy, Donald, in diapers together, having fun together. And Winthrop Kellogg, in his book, which was published in the 1930s, he talks about this chimpanzee following human pointing gestures. So those are the reasons why I think the chimpanzees and the bonobos and the wolves, the Brian Hare and some other people around that time tested why they did not follow human pointing gestures. Since then, and since the results that Monique and I found, and Nicole too, many people have gone out and have tested many different species of animal. And again and again and again, they find that if the animal is raised by human beings and if the animal depends on human beings, then it pays attention to how people move their limbs and the implications of gestures. I'll show you just a couple of my favorites that we did ourselves. The top right photograph, you see Nathan Hall, another of my past students, now a professor at Texas Tech University. He is at the Luby Bat Conservancy, which was not far from the University of Florida. And they have a lot of bats there. There are many different species. That didn't interest us greatly. The species didn't interest us greatly. What interested us was that the bats fall into two broad categories. One group of bats were born at the conservancy to their bat mothers and lived with their bat mothers in enclosures. They were raised by bats. You got bats raised by bats. But the second group of bats that they have at the conservancy are rejected pets. There are people who will take a young bat, they find it somehow, and they try and raise it as a pet, which you can do. I don't recommend it. And most people who try it, they get bored with the bat or the bat bites them and they want to get rid of it and they give it to the conservancy. So they have bat mother reared bats and they have human reared bats at the conservancy. And Nathan carried out the pointing experiment for the bats. And as you can see here, he had to point upwards because the bats move by pulling themselves across the ceiling of their cage. So he pointed up instead of down, but otherwise it was the exact same experiment. And Nathan found that human reared bats will follow human pointing gestures. Bat mother reared bats will not. Okay. So that's one of my favorites. And the other one I like is the one that Nicole Dory took the lead on. Again, this is when we were in Gainesville, Florida, North Central Florida, a lot of horse properties around there. And I still don't fully understand why, but there are people who raise their horses in a different way than the normal way, right? I don't ride a horse, but I understand the general principle. I've seen the movies. People control horses. They sit on the back of the horse and they control the horse by pulling on the reins and pushing with their feet. And I don't know, you don't need to tell me that I'm grossly oversimplifying how people ride horses, but basically you control the behavior of a horse with a series of things that you do to the horse, and you communicate with the horse while you're sitting on its back and it cannot actually see you, right? Because its eyes are facing forward. But there is this other way of training horses called Pirelli, and I don't completely understand why, but they stand on the ground in front of the horse and do things which include making gestures at the horse. And lo and behold, Pirelli trained horses who are used to having people communicate with them by standing in front of the horse where the horse can see them, those horses will follow human pointing gestures, whereas your standard issue horse that is not used to people communicating much from a position in front of it on the ground where the horse can see what you're doing, those horses do not follow pointing gestures. A couple of years ago, one of Monique's graduate students, so one of my grand students, if you like, published a review and found that 38 species of animal have been shown to be able to follow human pointing gestures if it has had suitable life experiences. So I think it's now a proven point that many different species can follow human pointing gestures. I'm going to skip a few slides because, as those of you that have been to my talks before know, I'm never very good at guessing how long a talk I haven't given before is going to take. So we're going to skip a couple of slides about the difference between tame and domestication. I will just slow down for a moment at this picture. This is a photo from what wildlife biologists call a camera trap. So this is just a camera that's left in the woods, and if anything moves, the camera takes a picture, and later the researchers can see what it is that went past. And this camera trap was set up around Chernobyl in Belarus. I'm sorry, in the Ukraine. My notes say Belarus, but Chernobyl is actually in the Ukraine, isn't it? And as I'm sure you know, 30 plus years ago now, there was a massive nuclear accident at Chernobyl, and humans left an enormous territory, and they left in a great hurry. And many of them left behind, unfortunately, their pets. And so some of the dogs that were left behind went wild. And this photograph shows us a feralized dog. This dog could not possibly be one of the original pets from whenever that was now. It was the 1980s, wasn't it? Because no dog could live that long. This dog must be a descendant from one of those dogs. It could actually be a wolf-dog hybrid for all we know. There are certainly wolves in that territory. The reason I show the picture is because let's not worry about the possibility of it being a possible hybrid for now. Let's just assume that it is a pure dog. Dogs are domesticated. Domestication is an evolutionary process that over the past 23,000 years dogs have evolved to be able to get along with people. But this particular dog almost certainly is not tame. We think of tameness and domestication in one breath as if they're the same thing, but they're not. Domestication is an evolutionary process. Over thousands of years, certain wolves have evolved to be able to get along with people more easily. And we call that group of wolves, we call them dogs, and they are indeed much easier to get along with. But that doesn't mean that they are born tame. If they don't interact with people early in life, they will end up wild. They will not be tame. And there's every reason to suppose that this dog, if we could go out to Chernobyl and find this dog would be as shy of us, as reluctant to form any kind of a relationship with us, and certainly not willing to follow a pointing gesture. It would be as wild as any wolf that might be out there in the forest around Chernobyl, as any bear or whatever other animals are there. It will be a wild animal. Just because you're a member of a domesticated species, that does not mean that you are guaranteed to be tame. You have to have the right life experiences to be tame. Now, taming dogs is extremely easy. And I like to say any 7-year-old can tame a dog, whereas it takes a lot of effort. As those of you that have visited Wolf Park and have learned about this will know, it takes a lot of effort to tame a wolf pup. And again, Monique Udell and Nathan Hall, who were involved in raising a litter of wolf pups quite a few years ago now. I couldn't remember off the top of my head how many. So why is that the case? Where does this difference lie? Well, this difference lies essentially in what biologists call the critical period for social imprinting. And I'm just going to call, for ease of explanation, the taming period. Here is a lifeline. It starts at birth. It ends after some unknown period of time in death. No animal is born knowing what species it belongs to. That's something every individual has to figure out for themselves during the critical period for social imprinting. In dogs, the critical period for social imprinting is relatively long. It ends with the animal being fearful towards unfamiliar things. In wolves, the critical period for social imprinting is much shorter. And that's why you don't meet many tame wolves, and it's really hard work to tame wolves because you have to get a lot of exposure to people into a brief period of time. In dogs, you hardly even notice that you tame dogs because it happens so naturally and so easily. So all of these thoughts led Monique and I to propose what we call the two-stage hypothesis. If you want a canid, or for that matter, really any other animal, to be responsive to what people are doing, it needs to be socialized to human beings during the critical period for social imprinting. And it needs to continue to live with people in such a way that the way people move their bodies carries information for the animal about things that matter to that animal. You may not think of yourself as carrying out exercises that teach your dog to follow your pointing gestures. But the truth is, every time you throw a ball or a frisbee or a stick, the movement of your arm predicts where that object is going to go. And your dog is motivated to pay attention to that movement of the arm. Sure, you've seen your dog watching your arm as you throw something, because that predicts where this object is going to go. The dog's not thinking about what is it he's got in his head and what does that mean for me. The dog is just becoming conditioned. Movement like that, object over there. That's all it is. And when you throw something or when you feed your animal with your hand, your animal learns this thing, this hand tells me where something's going to be. So as I say, and I apologize, and you can invite me back and we can do the other half of this talk next time, but I'm going to skip several slides because I put too much in here. And I'm just going to come to my take home slide, which is to say, well, what is the point then? Well, the point is we want to understand how it is that dogs can be so successful in human society and how they've grown away from their ancestors, wolves. I didn't actually talk about reduced flight distance. It's not essential to understanding pointing, really. I did talk about the crucial importance of social imprinting, or if it's easier, we can just call it taming. That has to happen Otherwise, the animal doesn't attend to people. And that is a crucial difference between dogs and wolves, their wild ancestors, and of course, all other wild animals. Out in nature, outside of Disney movies and whatever, animals don't make friends with members of other species. I'm sorry, but that's just not how it works. And then animals profit, dogs, domesticated animals profit from living near people because people are so wasteful. If you're around people, there's always something for a dog to gnaw on, to steal, and whatever. And I so miss the old cartoon writer Gary Larson because he had so many great cartoons that really spoke to many things, including domestication. And this, older members of the audience may remember this cartoon. It's such a good one. You see these wolves watching one of their group who's gotten close to the human settlement, and he's got an especially stupid look on his face. And one of the wolves is saying to the other, "It's Bobble, right? But look at those vacuous eyes, that stupid grin on his face. He's been domesticated, I tell you." So there we are. I'll draw the line there. I'm very lucky that I've worked over the years and continue to work with a number of fantastic young people that I couldn't do without them. And I hope I've left time to take your questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Clive, for that great presentation. We do have a few questions that we are going to get to in a minute. For those of you that do have some questions you haven't yet put in the Q&A, feel free to do that now. I just wanted to let everyone know before we launch into the questions that Wolf Park will be hosting not one, but two virtual seminars with Dr. Clive Wynne in the upcoming months. We have one that is a half-day seminar that is going to be happening on February 20th called Helping Dogs in Difficulties. And registration is open for that. We have another one coming up on May 1st called Dog is Love, Wolf is Wild, and that will be a full day seminar. And the registration is open for that as well. We also have our second Wolf Park webinar coming up on February 11th, and that will be given by Dr. Lindsay Merkham, who you saw in this PowerPoint, who is one of Dr. Wynn's previous students. Lindsay is the director of the Human Animal Wellness Collaboratory at Monmouth University. And that webinar will be at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, February 11th, and that registration just got put up today, so I encourage you to go sign up for that before it fills up. So we do have a few questions already in the Q&A, so I will pull that up. So the first is, did you find that certain breeds or types of breeds did better than others within the shelter populations that you studied?
Oh, okay. I was going to say yes, and now I need to say that in the shelter environment, we did not attempt to investigate that, not least because the vast majority of dogs in the shelter are mixed breed. So it would be extremely difficult. And we also know from work we did much later that when shelters try and guess what breeds are in a mixed breed dog, they almost always get it wrong. So you would have to do DNA testing to be able to identify what breeds are in there. Monique did carry out a study looking at a small number of targeted purebred dogs, not in shelters. And we were interested, and we did find big differences. And in particular, the livestock guarding dogs, and the ones, I'm pretty certain the ones that were in that study were Anatolian livestock guarding dogs from Turkey. They were very, very reluctant to follow pointing gestures. Those of you that know Anatolians may know that they are by and large very low responsive dogs. They don't tend to, if you throw a ball, they will not chase after the ball. So we have found breed difference in pointing ability, but not in the shelter environment. In the shelter environment, I skipped a little bit there. In the shelter environment, over the course of several studies, we tested 30 or 40 dogs on point following. We never found one that would succeed in the simple give them 10 chances and see how they do. Even though the vast majority of pet dogs will succeed if you just give them 10 chances, We never found a shelter dog that succeeded on that. And on the other hand, when we did the thing where we keep going for half an hour and see if they can pick it up, of the, I think, 20 dogs that were given the half an hour of training, 18 of the 20 were successful by the end of half an hour.
Awesome. So we have a few more questions. One person asks, is there any account of a human with little contact to other humans that would not understand pointing? So in essence, is pointing a learned behavior for every single species, including humans?
Well, so the first part of the question is sort of unanswerable, right? Because those stories of humans that lived and were raised by, like Romulus and Remus, raised by wolves, those kinds of stories never have enough detail. They're historical. You just can't know. What we do know is that people are not born following human pointing gestures, and it's not even a particularly early developing skill. On average, a baby, an infant, is well into their second year of life. They're like 18 months old before you can see that they follow human pointing gestures. So this places Brian Hare and Michael Tomasello in a strange situation because they published a paper where they claimed that dog puppies are born following human pointing gestures. They claimed that you could test dog pups, and as soon as their eyes were open, they would follow human pointing gestures. And I now forget how many weeks old that is, but it's not very many weeks old. They said the puppies were following human pointing gestures. Whereas meanwhile, it's thoroughly established. And anybody who has had a baby or, is having a baby, try this. You'll find it takes months, around 18 months of life before a human being follows a pointing gesture. So they created this bizarre situation where they're claiming that dogs have evolved to understand people to a higher level than people have evolved to understand people, which is, of course, a complete absurdity.
That is fascinating. We also have a question about the dog inside familiar pointing data. They were asking where that was, so that might have been somewhere in the PowerPoint, or maybe got left off.
No, we never did. We never did dog inside familiar. And I now cannot remember what our reasoning was as to why that wasn't necessary.
Okay.
But I mean, we know, I mean, a lot of people have studied this now, and there certainly have been studies done, dogs in their own homes being pointed to by their own owners. And dogs do very well at that. They do very well at that. And I invite anybody who's in the seminar today to try this with your dog afterwards. If you do it, your dog, it'll work really well.
Awesome. We had a question wanting a link to the Wolf Park seminars that you will be doing in the next couple of months. So I'm not sure if everybody was able to get the answer I typed, but that would be wolfpark.org/seminars. And both of those seminars are up and available for registration. Also, John Lassard asked if there is a link to the study saying that wolves and dogs parted 23,000 years ago.
Okay, so that is brand spanking new. I mean, it's not me, of course. I'm not the geneticist archaeologist. That's brand spanking new. It's in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It got a good write-up in Science Magazine, which is widely available, and I have shared on social media. Jean, I think you and I follow each other on social media. I could try and find it now. I don't know, do I have time to try and see if I can quickly or we can communicate offline if I'm not finding it quickly. It's the first author is Angela Perry, my good friend Angela Perry. Here we go. I think it's yeah, here we go. Okay, I'm going to put this in the, where's it gone? Here, I'm going to put this in the chat. That was a good report on it.
Excellent. Okay, yeah, and we can potentially put that into the YouTube description, or maybe in one of the follow-up emails to this webinar for those of you who are not watching this live or cannot get the link out of the chat. But we are running a little bit over time, so I think we have one more question that would be good to kind of end with, and that is, now that we know animals that have been conditioned to observe pointing and human gestures, what is the next step research-wise? Are there any interesting hypotheses being tested at this point? So
Oh,
what's next, Clive?
absolutely. So so for me, and this is, you know, the other seminar that Christopher just named, the Dog is Love, Wolf is Wild. So my book, Dog is Love, is about how Brian Hare and other people, Harry Frank, and so on, they argued that dogs are special, dogs are so successful because they have special forms of cognition, special forms of intelligence. I became convinced over several years of research, of which this is a tiny piece, that that was wrong and that there's not actually anything special about dog cognition, about dog intelligence, dog smarts. What I do believe is remarkable about dogs, it lies more in the emotional realm, in their ability and their drive and their desire to form strong, affectionate bonds with us and with other species. It's not specially about us, it's about dogs' ability to bond with members of other species. And so, aside from the applied research, which I touched on very briefly because it is such a big part of our work these days, the research that interests me is research into what is the nature of dogs' ability to form affectionate bonds. And so that's what I study nowadays. I'm not interested anymore in questions like the ones I've been sharing with you today. I'm so completely convinced that dogs' ability to pay attention to what people do stems from what are really quite basic mechanisms and are not any special form of cognition. All I'm interested in is, well, how do dogs come to love people so much? And what does it mean? And how far can it go? So those are all things I talk about in Dog is Love, Wolf is Wild, and in my book, Dog is Love.
Yeah, so everybody should definitely go order that book and also register for that upcoming virtual seminar. But thank you so much, Clive, for joining us this evening and putting together this presentation for us. It was so great. And thank you to everybody who attended and asked questions. We hope to see you at our next virtual program or hopefully at Wolf Park soon. So thank you guys again.
Yeah, thank you, Christopher, for setting it up. And thank you, everybody, for, I was going to say coming out, but for, you know, sitting at your computer. I enjoyed talking with you. Bye for now.
Absolutely. Bye.